So, I work as a food delivery driver for this small catering service that handles late-night orders. We get all kinds of calls, people wanting anything from a big meal to some weird midnight craving. I took this job after moving to a rural part of Oregon, a quiet area surrounded by forest. Honestly, there was something kind of comforting about driving on empty roads at night, with the forest all around me in the dark. It was a Friday night in late October, and I had just finished my last scheduled delivery. It was almost midnight, and the air was freezing, the kind that cuts right through you. I was ready to head home when my boss called and told me about a last-minute order that had just come in. "It's a rush order, Angela," he said, sounding a bit annoyed. The customer insisted. "It's a cabin up near Wolf Creek Road. They ordered our special, the steak dinner for 2. I had no idea where Wolf Creek Road was, but I figured I could use the extra tip, so I agreed to take it. My boss handed me the packed food, gave me the address, and I was on my way. I put the address into my GPS, which said it was a 20-minute drive. The route took me away from the town streetlights and deeper into the forest, and the road got narrower as I went. The drive felt way longer than I expected. The trees crowded in on both sides of the dirt road, almost like they were closing in. My headlights were the only light, showing the worn-out path ahead. Finally, my GPS told me I had reached my destination. I pulled up to an old cabin. There were no lights on, but I could make out the shape of the building hidden among the trees. Tall grass surrounded it, and the only sign of a driveway was the flattened dirt my car was parked on. I suddenly felt nervous as I grabbed the food, telling myself it was just the cold. I walked up to the cabin and knocked on the door. No one answered. I tried again, a bit louder, but still nothing. I was about to leave when I heard a noise, a soft creak, coming from the side of the cabin. I looked to the left and barely saw a shadow moving between the trees. It seemed like it was coming closer. A man stepped out from the darkness. He was tall and thin, with a pale face that seemed completely out of place in the woods. His eyes were sunken, and he had a strange smile on his face. "Ah, you must be the delivery girl," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded, handing him the food, feeling more and more uneasy. He took the bag, but didn't go back inside. He just stood there, staring at me, that weird smile still on his face. "You know," he said, "not many people come out this far. It's pretty brave of you." I forced a polite laugh, trying to ignore the discomfort. "Well, it's my job," I said, taking a step back toward my car. He looked past me, his eyes scanning the dark woods, then back at me. "Would you mind waiting a moment? I'll get you a tip." Before I could say anything, he disappeared around the side of the cabin, leaving me alone. The silence made me uneasy, and every little noise stood out. Rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and then the soft sound of footsteps. Footsteps that weren't his. I turned my head, squinting into the darkness. In the corner of my vision, I saw movement. Shadows shifting between the trees. I realized several figures were slowly approaching the cabin. I turned and ran to my car. The ground was uneven, and I could hear the footsteps getting closer. I didn't look back. My hands fumbled with the keys, my breathing quick and shaky. I unlocked the door just as something brushed against my shoulder. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, and the headlights came on to reveal 3 figures just a few feet away. I couldn't see their faces, but they stood silently, staring at me. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away from the cabin. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figures slowly moving back into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. I drove until I got back to the main road. I pulled over and took a moment to catch my breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I looked at my GPS, but the address was gone, like it had never been there. I tried typing it in again, but nothing came up. There was no record of a cabin on Wolf Creek Road. When I got back to the catering service, my boss was waiting with a concerned look. I explained what had happened. The strange man, the figures in the woods, the missing address. He frowned and shook his head. "Wolf Creek Road?" he said, his voice low. "There's nothing out there. No cabins, no houses. It's just forest." I insisted that I had been there, that I'd seen the cabin and the man, but he just gave me a wary look, like he didn't believe me. He told me to take the rest of the night off, that I must be tired, but I knew what I had seen. I knew I wasn't imagining it. A week later, I quit the job. The thought of driving down those dark, empty roads again, of delivering food to places that might not even be real, was too much. I moved to a different part of town, closer to the city, where the lights were always on and the streets were never empty. I try to move on. I want to believe it's over, but part of me can't let go of the feeling that it never really ended. Delivering food isn't the most exciting job, but it worked for me. I got to drive around town, stay out of an office, and it paid the bills. I moved back home a few months ago to save some money, and this job was just what I needed. But last Thursday night, something happened that I can't forget. It started as a simple mix-up, but ended up being one of the strangest and creepiest nights of my life. It was around 10 p.m., and I was almost done with my shift when an order came in for a small house at the edge of town. A burger, fries, and a milkshake. Nothing out of the ordinary. I grabbed the bag, put it in my car, and drove to the address. The house was a bit isolated, but still technically in town. Looked pretty normal, with a porch light on and a couple of old cars in the driveway. I rang the doorbell, and a woman in her late 30s answered, her face lit by the porch light. I handed her the bag. She smiled, thanked me, and took it. As I headed back, my phone buzzed. It was the takeout place. My boss told me I needed to go back to that house. The customer called and said they got the wrong order. I was pretty sure I grabbed the right bag, but mistakes happen, so I turned around. The drive back was short, maybe 5 minutes. When I pulled up, I noticed the porch light was off and the whole house was dark. I got out, walked up to the door and rang the bell. No answer. I knocked louder. Still nothing. I checked the address on my phone. It was definitely the right house. The same cars were in the driveway, but something felt off. I stepped back and looked around. The neighborhood was quiet, no lights in any windows. I called my boss again and told him I was back at the house, but no one was answering and the lights were off. "Just leave it at the door then," he said, clearly not wanting to deal with it. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." I hung up and set the bag on the doormat. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint shuffling, like someone moving inside. I hesitated, then knocked again. No response, but I could swear I heard something. Maybe a whisper. I decided I'd had enough. As I walked back to my car, I heard it again. The shuffling, louder this time. I turned back and thought I saw a pale face staring at me from the window. I blinked, but it was gone. Maybe it was my imagination, but I needed to leave. I got into my car, started the engine, and glanced back at the house. The porch was still dark, and the windows were empty. I put the car in reverse, backing out of the driveway, when my phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number. I hesitated but answered. "Hello?" My voice came out shaky. There was a moment of silence, and then I heard it. The same whispering I thought I'd heard from inside the house. It was faint, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I hung up immediately. I sped out of there. The roads were empty. When I got back, I rushed inside, feeling relieved just being around other people. My boss barely looked up from the register. "Everything okay?" he asked. I tried to explain. how the lights were off, how I thought I saw someone watching me. He just shrugged, uninterested. Probably just someone messing around. Don't worry about it. I nodded, still uneasy. I finished my shift and went home, but I barely slept. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to drive past the house in daylight. It was probably a stupid idea, but I had to know if it was real. When I got there, I almost didn't recognize it. The house looked abandoned, overgrown lawn, grimy windows, and cracked porch steps. It seemed like no one had lived there for years. I got out and walked up the driveway. The cars from last night were gone. I stepped onto the porch and the wood creaked. When I knocked, the door swung open by itself. Inside, the house was empty. The air was stale, and dust covered everything. No sign of the woman or any furniture. It was like the house had been abandoned for years. I backed out, my hands shaking as I pulled the door shut. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the porch that hadn't been there before. The takeout bag I had left the night before. It was sitting there, untouched, the receipt with my handwriting still stapled to it. I stared at it. There was no way it should have been there. I didn't take it. I turned and ran back to my car, got in, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened at that house. Maybe it was a prank, but it felt too real. Now, whenever I drive past the edge of town, I avoid that road. I don't want to see the house again. I don't want to know if it's still there, waiting, with that bag still sitting on the porch. Being a delivery driver means dealing with all kinds of people. Some are nice, some don't care, and some are just plain rude. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I got attacked over a small mistake. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was on my last delivery of the night. The order was for a large pepperoni pizza, garlic bread, and a couple of sodas. Seemed simple enough. I drove to the address, a house that looked a bit run down but still had the lights on and a car in the driveway. I parked, grabbed the bag, and walked up to the door. I rang the doorbell, and almost right away, this guy in his 40s opened the door. He looked exhausted, red eyes, like he hadn't slept in a while. I forced a smile as I held up the pizza and drinks. He took the bags, looked inside, and his face twisted into a scowl. He started asking about the missing ranch dressing, getting louder with each word. I stayed calm, apologized, and said I could call the store to sort it out, but he just shook his head, his face turning red. He muttered about how delivery people never get it right. He wasn't listening, and I could see his frustration growing. Then he demanded his money back, but I tried to explain I wasn't the one who handled payments. Before I could finish, he lunged at me. Suddenly, his hand clamped down on my arm, yanking me toward the door. I struggled to pull away, yelling for him to let go. He yanked harder, almost knocking me off my feet. The drinks fell to the ground, bottles rolling away as I twisted out of his grip and stumbled backward onto the porch. He came at me again, face twisted in anger. He was yelling, but I couldn't even understand what he was saying. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted to my car. I slammed the door shut just as he reached the car, his fists pounding on the window. "Get back here!" he screamed, his face twisted in rage. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, tires squealing as I sped away. I didn't stop until I was back at the pizza place. I parked the car, took a deep breath, and went inside. My boss looked up, his face going from confused to concerned as soon as he saw me. He asked if I was okay, and I managed to explain what had happened, describing the guy's rage and the attack. My boss's eyes widened, and he grabbed the phone right away to call the police. He told me to sit down and take a breath, pointing to one of the chairs by the counter. I sank into the chair, catching my breath. My boss talked to the dispatcher, explaining what happened, while I kept replaying the scene in my head. I couldn't shake the guy's angry face from my mind. The police showed up a short while later. They took my statement, asked questions about what had happened, what the guy looked like, and whether I was hurt. Luckily, aside from some bruises on my arm, I was okay. They told me I did the right thing by getting away and calling it in. After they left, my boss offered me a few days off, but I already knew I wouldn't be coming back. I needed time to think, and he nodded, understanding. A few days later, I heard from a coworker that the guy had been arrested. Apparently, he had a history of violent behavior, and this wasn't the first time he'd attacked someone. The police found him still angry, still yelling about the missing dressing. It was a relief knowing he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. The whole experience was too much for me. I found a different job, one that didn't involve knocking on strangers' doors late at night. It was less exciting, but at least I felt safe, and that was what mattered most.